Clara Sullivan ripped the $50,000 bank draft from Jeremiah Cox's hand and tore it in half in front of his 8-year-old daughter, Iris. "Men like you don't walk in here with this kind of money," she sneered, looking him up and down like something she had scraped off her shoe. Then she called the local sheriff to report fraud. Jeremiah pulled Iris close and told Clara calmly that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. As branch security moved to drag him toward the door, Clara's boss walked in, saw the torn paper on the floor, and went pale. "Mr. Cox," he said. "Why? Now, let us go back to where it all started." Jeremiah Cox had learned a long time ago that the world made up its mind about a black man in 1945 before he ever opened his mouth. He was 42 years old, and for the last 6 years he had been raising his daughter alone in a small house on the edge of Maple Hollow, a quiet town where nobody looked twice at his old Model T or the wool coat he had owned since before Iris was born. His wife had passed away during childbirth in another city, and Jeremiah had simply kept going because there was no other option that made sense to him. He drove Iris to school every morning, cooked dinner every night, and had never once missed a church choir recital or a parent meeting, not even when late-night hauling work kept him up until 2 in the morning. Nobody at Iris's school knew that the quiet man who showed up in faded overalls and a patched coat had built Cox Logistics and hauling from a single wooden cart into a thriving regional enterprise that served farmers and merchants across 3 counties. Jeremiah preferred it that way. He did not want his daughter growing up believing that money made a person important or that a man's worth could be read off the label of his coat. He wore the same pocket watch he had inherited from his father, drove the same dependable truck, and kept his success folded quietly into the background of an ordinary life visible only to the people who actually needed to know it existed. That morning, a cashier's draft for $50,000 had cleared into his hands, the proceeds of a prime tract of commercial timberland he had sold to an expanding regional railroad company. Jeremiah already knew where the money was going. Half of it would go into a trust fund for Iris's future, untouched until she was old enough to go to college. The other half was meant to seed an educational scholarship for black children being raised by single parents or sharecroppers, the kind of family he understood better than most, having lived every version of the exhaustion that came with it. He brought Iris along because they had a plan for the rest of the day, one she had been talking about since breakfast. First the bank, then the local mercantile, then dinner at the diner on 5th Street. It was supposed to be the easiest stop of the afternoon, a formality, before the two of them got back to being father and daughter instead of founder and dependent. Neither of them expected the visit to take more than 10 minutes. Jeremiah had promised Iris she could pick out 3 new storybooks instead of the usual one since he was in such a remarkably good mood. They walked into the downtown branch of Holstead National Bank not long before closing time. Jeremiah had kept an account there for 15 years, long before Iris was born, and long before Cox Logistics had a name that anyone recognized outside of local merchants and agrarian supply yards. But the woman sitting behind the manager's desk that day, Clara Sullivan, had only transferred to that branch a few weeks earlier. She did not know his history, had never pulled up his account, and had no idea that the soft-spoken black man standing in the doorway had been a fixture of that building's ledgers for a decade and a half, long before she ever set foot inside it. Clara's eyes moved over Jeremiah the moment he walked in, then down to Iris, and then out the window to the dusty Ford truck he had parked along the curb. Other customers who came through the front doors in tailored suits were greeted warmly before they even reached the oak counter. Jeremiah and his daughter stood waiting while 3 tellers stayed idle behind their windows. None of them called forward to help. Iris tugged gently at her father's sleeve and asked quietly why nobody was helping them yet. Jeremiah told her to be patient, and that it never paid to assume the worst about people before they had done anything to earn it. When Jeremiah finally reached the counter, he placed the $50,000 cashier's draft down and asked for it to be deposited into the commercial account he had held for 15 years. The amount printed on the draft caught the teller's attention immediately, and within seconds, Clara Sullivan was standing behind the counter herself. Instead of pulling up his account record or checking the deposit history attached to his name, something any manager could have done in under a minute, she began questioning him about where the money had come from, her voice loud enough for half the lobby to hear. Jeremiah answered every question without losing his composure. He handed over his state identification, his bank book, his commercial license, and the official legal contracts confirming the sale of his timberland to the railroad company. He offered to let Clara call the issuing bank or the railroad's legal counsel directly so she could verify everything herself in a matter of minutes. It was, by any reasonable standard, far more than enough for a transaction that should have taken no time at all. Clara looked at the legal documents without really reading them. She told Jeremiah that a black man carrying a $50,000 bank draft would not be driving an old farm truck or wearing a patched wool coat like that. A young teller named Alice Fisher offered to make the verification phone call herself, but Clara cut her off before she could reach for the receiver, ordering her back to her station in a tone that left no room for discussion. By then, several customers had noticed the tension building at the counter, and a few turned around to stare openly. One man said loud enough for Iris to hear that a colored man like Jeremiah was probably using his own daughter to make a forged document scheme look more convincing. Nobody in the lobby spoke up against the comment. They simply watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Iris's hand found her father's and gripped it tightly, her earlier excitement draining out of her all at once. Jeremiah kept his voice even and asked Clara one more time to make the phone call to the issuing bank before this went any further. His calm only seemed to provoke her. In front of the tellers, the armed guard, and every customer watching, Clara announced that the cashier's draft was fraudulent, though she had not verified a single detail of it. Jeremiah reminded her evenly that she was handling a customer's legitimate financial assets and should think carefully about what she did next, hoping the warning would land before things escalated. Clara heard that reminder as an insult instead of a warning. She snatched the paper off the wooden counter, looked directly at Jeremiah, and told him that people like him did not walk in here with $50,000. Then she tore it in half and into smaller pieces, letting them fall to the tiled floor at his boots in full view of his daughter. The lobby went completely silent. Iris bent down as if to gather the torn scraps, but Jeremiah stopped her gently, unwilling to let his daughter kneel on the floor to collect what someone had just used to humiliate him. He looked at Clara and told her without raising his voice that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Clara called the local police dispatcher, reporting that a colored man was using forged documents, threatening staff, and refusing to leave the premises. She then ordered Colton West, the branch's security guard, to escort Jeremiah out of the building immediately. Colton hesitated for a long moment before stepping forward, uncertain why he was being asked to remove a man who had done nothing but stand quietly at a counter. But a direct order from his manager left him little room to argue in front of a lobby full of witnesses. Iris looked up at her father as the guard approached, her eyes wide with a fear no 8-year-old should have had to carry into a bank on an ordinary afternoon. Jeremiah tightened his hand around hers, keeping his voice low so only she could hear him, telling her that everything would be fine as long as she stayed close. Jeremiah understood the delicate position he was in. He could resist and risk turning a tense situation into something dangerous with Iris standing beside him, or he could stay calm and wait for the truth to catch up. He chose not to fight the order, but he also refused to walk out the door before someone confirmed what he already knew to be true. He glanced down at the torn pieces scattered across the floor, the remnants of a trust fund that had not even had the chance to exist yet, and felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with anger. It was closer to absolute certainty. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes, this had stopped being about a $50,000 bank draft and started being about every assumption a room full of strangers had made about him before he ever spoke. He held on to that thought as Colton's hand settled lightly on his arm, walking toward the heavy glass doors with Iris pressed against his side. Colton kept his grip light as they moved forward, but Iris could not stop looking back at the torn paper on the floor. Iris reached up and wrapped both arms around her father's waist, pressing her face into his side, and begged the guard in a small voice not to take him away. Colton's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, caught between a manager's direct command and the plain evidence of his own eyes. Clara called out from behind the counter, telling one of the tellers to hold Iris back so the girl could not, as she put it, be used to obstruct bank staff from performing their duties. It was the first time Jeremiah's calm cracked. He had absorbed the baseless suspicions about the bank draft, the insults about his truck and his coat, even the humiliation of watching his money torn apart in front of strangers. But the moment someone suggested putting hands on his daughter, his entire posture changed. He told the tellers in a tone that left no room for argument that no one was to touch Iris. Clara seized on that reaction immediately, shouting to the lobby that his sudden intensity was proof of the aggression she had been warning them about since he walked through the door. Jeremiah understood in that instant that every word out of his mouth and every movement of his body was being judged through a lens that had already decided who he was before he ever spoke. He lowered his voice, kept his hands clearly visible at his sides, and pulled Iris in close against his hip. It struck him standing there how quickly a father's instinct to protect his daughter could be twisted into evidence against him by people determined to see a threat. He had spent 6 years building a quiet life where Iris never had to see him lose his composure, and now a bank manager was rewriting that protectiveness into something dangerous simply because it suited her narrative. Alice Fisher spoke up again, the second time she had tried to intervene since the confrontation began. She reminded Clara as steadily as she could manage that Jeremiah had not threatened anyone, and that a single telephone call to the railroad's legal department or the issuing bank would settle the entire matter in minutes. Clara turned on her instead, threatening to terminate her employment on the spot if she said another word in front of the customers. Alice did not back down completely, but she stopped speaking, aware that losing her job would help no one in that room, least of all the man standing beside his frightened child. She glanced at Jeremiah for a moment, her eyes conveying that she believed him, even if she could not speak out loud without risking her livelihood. Alice had worked at the branch for a little over a year, and she had watched Clara dismiss local colored patrons in ways that never sat right with her. Standing there watching Iris cry, she knew that whatever excuses she had made in the past no longer held up. The other customers in the lobby lowered their heads or stepped back, avoiding eye contact. Nobody stepped between Clara and the family she was humiliating in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. They wanted to watch, but none of them wanted to risk anything by standing up for a stranger. Iris looked around the room and asked her father quietly why nobody would say he had done nothing wrong. Several people turned away when she said it. Nobody answered her. Jeremiah felt that silence settle heavy in his chest, knowing his daughter was learning a painful lesson about how cold the world could be when good people stayed quiet. Colton began walking Jeremiah and Iris toward the glass doors at the front of the branch, his hand resting lightly on Jeremiah's shoulder rather than gripping it, as though some part of him resisted what he was doing. The lobby had gone quiet except for the low murmur of watching customers and the ticking of the large brass clock on the wall. Jeremiah counted his steps toward the exit, a calm practice that kept his mind clear during difficult negotiations. Iris's small hand stayed locked around 2 of his fingers, her body trembling even though she had stopped crying. He whispered softly to her that everything would be sorted out once they stepped outside. Clara watched them go with her arms crossed, completely satisfied that she had protected her branch, unaware that the man walking toward the exit held immense economic weight. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors swung open and Henry Sterling walked in, wearing a tailored wool suit and holding a leather briefcase. Henry was the regional vice president of Holstead National Bank, and he had traveled to this specific branch to meet Jeremiah for a scheduled late-afternoon conference. The 2 men were finalizing a $75,000 institutional credit agreement between the bank and Cox Logistics, a major commercial contract that had been months in development. Henry took 2 steps inside before he understood the scene unfolding before him. Jeremiah Cox, the respected businessman he was preparing to meet, stood with a security guard's hand on his shoulder while his daughter clung to his waist in tears. Torn scraps of paper lay scattered across the polished floor near his boots. Henry dropped his briefcase, the heavy leather thudding against the floor. For a moment, he stood motionless, taking in the scene before turning his gaze to Jeremiah. Then he spoke 2 words that completely changed the atmosphere in the room: Mr. Cox. Henry's authoritative voice echoed through the lobby, causing everyone to freeze. Colton immediately removed his hand from Jeremiah's shoulder and stepped back, realizing he had laid hands on someone of importance. Clara hurried forward, attempting to explain quickly that she had just intercepted a $50,000 fraud attempt by a local colored man. Henry looked at her with a stern expression before asking if she had any idea who the man standing in front of her actually was. Clara opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, realizing the gravity of the question. She glanced at Jeremiah, then at Iris, and back to Henry, her face draining of color as she searched for words. Around the lobby, the patrons who had been watching silently lowered their eyes and exchanged bewildered looks. Henry faced the room and clearly announced that Jeremiah Cox was the founder and owner of Cox Logistics, one of the bank's most valuable commercial account holders in the district. He explained that Jeremiah was here to finalize a major enterprise agreement with Holstead National and that the cashier's draft was entirely legitimate, issued directly by the Regional Railroad Authority earlier that morning. Henry then knelt down in front of Iris, speaking gently and apologizing directly to her for the disgraceful manner in which her father had been treated inside a bank that bore his institution's name. It was a quiet, profound moment, marking the first time since they had entered the bank that anyone had acknowledged Iris's feelings or treated her with genuine respect. The dynamic in the lobby shifted instantly. The customers who had watched in passive silence suddenly turned away in shame, avoiding Jeremiah's gaze. The tellers behind the counter froze, fidgeting with their ledgers and looking down at their desks, visibly uncomfortable. Clara Sullivan, stripped of her arrogance for the first time, stood speechless. The man who had previously insinuated that Jeremiah was using his daughter to pull off a scam shuffled his feet and stared at the floorboards, unable to make eye contact with anyone. Clara straightened her collar and attempted to regain her composure, refusing to take full responsibility. She defensively insisted that Jeremiah was partially to blame for the misunderstanding, arguing that a man carrying a $50,000 bank draft should have identified himself immediately upon entering or dressed in a manner fitting his financial standing. Jeremiah looked at her calmly and asked whether a patron needed to be prominent or dressed in fine silk before being granted basic human courtesy. Clara stammered, claiming she was merely following standard security procedures, repeating the phrase as if it could justify her actions. Henry pointed to the torn pieces of the draft scattered on the floor and asked her to cite the exact bank procedure that permitted a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal financial document in front of his child. "There is no such procedure, Clara," Henry said sternly. "There never has been." Clara flushed with embarrassment, attempting to speak before realizing she had no defense. Unable to answer, she shifted her blame onto Jeremiah once again, suggesting that bringing his young daughter into a business transaction had made the situation unnecessarily emotional. That remark crossed a line for Jeremiah, and the quiet intensity in his eyes made even Henry take a step back. Henry immediately instructed Clara to surrender her office keys and employee ledger, ordering her to step away from her desk without touching any records. He declared in front of everyone present that a full formal audit of her branch management would be conducted immediately. Seeing her position collapsing, Clara tried to slip behind her desk to remove a handwritten log entry she had recorded moments earlier, one that falsely categorized Jeremiah as an aggressive vagrant attempting fraud. Her fingers reached for the logbook, but Alice Fisher stepped forward swiftly, placing her hand firmly over the ledger to stop her. Alice told Clara steadily that the record would remain untouched, then turned to Henry and informed him that the transaction details and written statements from the tellers were fully intact. Clara turned pale, realizing her attempt to alter the record had failed right in front of the regional vice president. Henry terminated Clara's employment on the spot, right there in the main lobby, in front of the same patrons who had watched her tear the draft apart minutes earlier. Clara quietly asked to move the conversation to a private office, but Henry refused her request directly, stating that since she had chosen to humiliate Mr. Cox in public, she would answer for her conduct in full view of the public as well. Turning to Colton West, Henry took a more measured approach. He acknowledged that Colton had hesitated to use force against Jeremiah and had immediately stepped back the moment he heard Henry speak. Henry suspended Colton pending a full administrative review, explaining that the suspension would give the institution time to evaluate the situation thoroughly before making a final determination regarding his status. Colton nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping with a mixture of shame and relief. He quietly admitted that he should have questioned Clara's directive the moment she issued it instead of complying simply because she was the branch manager. "I knew something felt wrong," he muttered under his breath. "I just did not trust my own judgment enough to speak up." Jeremiah, holding Iris close to his side, felt no lingering anger toward the guard, who had at least displayed hesitation, unlike the manager who had ordered his removal. The local sheriff arrived shortly after, responding to Clara's earlier phone call reporting a black man causing a disturbance and attempting fraud. 2 officers entered the lobby, scanning the room carefully. For a brief moment, Jeremiah felt a familiar tension in his chest, a protective reflex born of living under restrictive social norms where misunderstandings could quickly become dangerous for a black man. Henry immediately stepped forward to clarify that the complaint was entirely false, though the officers still had to complete an official incident record since the call had been logged by the dispatcher. One of the officers apologized for the inconvenience while taking down Jeremiah's statement, acknowledging quietly that the dispatch report had overstated the situation. Jeremiah remained composed throughout the questioning, keeping his answers brief and precise to prevent any frustration from being misconstrued as hostility. Alice Fisher provided her account without hesitation, detailing Clara's actions from the moment Jeremiah walked through the door and highlighting how Clara had threatened to fire her for offering to make a simple verification call. Several customers who had witnessed the interaction stepped forward as well, confirming Jeremiah's account and admitting they should have spoken up when Clara tore the bank draft apart. News of the incident spread rapidly throughout the town by evening. By the following morning, local newspaper reporters were gathering outside the branch, asking questions of anyone willing to speak on record. Journalists soon learned that Jeremiah was a devoted single father who had built a successful enterprise from scratch, and that the $50,000 draft was intended to establish an educational trust fund for children raised by single parents and sharecroppers. Photographs of Jeremiah working at Cox Logistics surfaced alongside statements from neighbors describing him as a quiet, hard-working man who served his community without seeking recognition. The stark contrast between Jeremiah's intentions and the humiliating treatment he received sparked widespread public discussion regarding the practices of regional institutions. Holstead National Bank faced immediate public scrutiny, prompting executive board members to demand a swift resolution from Henry Sterling to ensure Jeremiah did not withdraw his commercial business. Board members who had never previously concerned themselves with individual branch operations were suddenly anxious to contain the reputational damage. Henry spent the night addressing concerns from senior leadership, maintaining that full accountability was the only acceptable path forward. When executives suggested offering a private financial settlement to quietly conclude the matter, Henry refused, explaining that Jeremiah Cox was a man of high principle who could not be brought into silence. Subsequent internal reviews uncovered a broader pattern of mistreatment under Clara's management, revealing that several prior complaints from patrons had been ignored by local supervisory leadership. The systematic dismissal of these grievances highlighted procedural failures within the branch network, prompting regional directors to enact comprehensive operational reforms. Within 48 hours, law enforcement formally closed their inquiry, confirming there was no evidence of fraud or unlawful conduct by Jeremiah. Clara Sullivan lost her manager credentials permanently and faced civil actions regarding her discriminatory actions and false reports. Alice Fisher was promoted to head manager of the downtown branch, recognized for her integrity and courage in standing up for truth during the ordeal. Colton West was required to complete a newly established protocol training program, learning to assess directives carefully before carrying them out. When Jeremiah met Colton weeks later, the guard offered a sincere apology, admitting he wished he had trusted his conscience sooner. Jeremiah accepted his apology warmly, noting that Colton's refusal to use harsh force had shown his underlying decency. The bank reissued the cashier's draft, and Jeremiah allocated the $50,000 precisely as intended. Half was placed into Iris's educational trust fund, while the remaining $25,000 established the Cox Foundation, a permanent endowment created to support children of single parents and working families across the region. Jeremiah specified that the trust's administrative office be located right in the downtown branch, transforming a place of past humiliation into a beacon of community empowerment and opportunity. 3 months later, Jeremiah and Iris walked back through those same glass doors. He still wore his modest coat and drove his familiar Ford truck, remaining true to his values despite the surrounding changes. Iris held his hand comfortably, feeling secure beside her father. The atmosphere inside the bank was noticeably different. Staff greeted them respectfully the moment they entered, offering immediate assistance without hesitation. A newly installed brass plaque near the lobby entrance outlined customer rights in clear, accessible language, alongside details regarding the Cox Foundation. Alice came forward to welcome them warmly, sharing that the new institutional guidelines were already yielding positive results throughout the district. Near the counter, a young mother was opening her child's first savings account, received with warmth and dignity. Iris watched the scene silently before turning to her father, asking if this positive change was the reason he had chosen to forgive the bank rather than taking his business elsewhere. Jeremiah smiled gently, explaining that tearing down an institution was simple, but reforming it to serve everyone fairly was far more meaningful. Iris nodded thoughtfully, understanding the lesson deeply. Before departing, Jeremiah let Iris hand the very first educational grant letter to a young student, watching her pride blossom. Father and daughter left the building together, continuing their afternoon plans with a visit to the local mercantile and dinner at the 5th Street Diner. Jeremiah's true victory lay not in receiving an apology, but in ensuring that everyone who walked through those doors after him would be treated with honor and respect.